Chapter 1. The first sensation that pierced through Kai's fog-shrouded consciousness wasn't pain, it was luxury. Egyptian cotton sheets caressed his skin like whispered promises, and the scent of expensive cologne lingered in air conditioned to perfection. His eyes fluttered open to reveal a ceiling that belonged in a Renaissance palace, hand-painted cherubs dancing around gilded moldings, their innocent faces mocking his dire situation. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice was velvet over steel, cultured and dangerous. Kai's head snapped toward its source, movement sending lightning bolts of pain through his skull. A young man sat with predatory grace in a leather chair that probably cost more than Kai's yearly tuition, one leg crossed over the other with casual elegance. He was devastatingly handsome in the way that Italian Renaissance painters captured angels, sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, full lips that suggested both cruelty and passion, and eyes the color of winter storms. But it was the perfectly tailored three-piece suit that truly unsettled Kai. Who wore Armani to kidnap someone? The ceiling was painted by a student of Michelangelo. The man continued conversationally, swirling amber liquid in a crystal tumbler that caught the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. My great-great-grandfather acquired the dirt in a particularly profitable venture in Florence, along with several other acquisitions. Kai struggled to sit up, his wrists bearing angry red marks from zip ties. The room around him screamed wealth and power. Persian rugs that museums would kill for, oil paintings whose signatures he recognized from art history textbooks, and furniture that belonged in European castles. This wasn't some dingy warehouse or abandoned building. This was a fortress disguised as paradise. Who are you? Kai's voice came out hoarser than intended, betraying the fear he was desperately trying to suppress. The man stood with fluid grace, setting his glass on a side table with deliberate precision. He was tall, at least 6'2", with the kind of lean, muscled build that suggested deadly competence beneath the designer clothes. Alessandro Torino, he said, the name rolling off his tongue like a caress and a threat. And you, Kai Chen, are currently a guest in my home. The blood in Kai's veins turned to ice water. Even a literature student buried in books and academic pursuits knew that name. The Torinos weren't just another crime family. They were the crime family. 3 generations of power, influence, and carefully orchestrated violence that had shaped the criminal underworld of the entire East Coast. They were ghosts that moved fortunes, toppled governments, and made people disappear without a trace. Why am I here? Kai managed, though part of him dreaded the answer. Alessandro moved to the window, his silhouette backlit by the golden afternoon sun. Beyond the glass, Kai caught glimpses of manicured gardens, marble fountains, and men in expensive suits who moved with the fluid alertness of professional killers. Your father owes my family a rather substantial debt. $8.7 million to be precise, plus interest. You are collateral. My father? Kai laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitter incredulity. My father abandoned my mother and me when I was 12 years old. I haven't seen him in over a decade. I don't even know if he's still alive. For the first time since awakening, Kai saw Alessandro's perfect composure crack. Surprise flickered across his features, followed quickly by what looked suspiciously like irritation. That's unfortunate. Unfortunate? Kai's fear was rapidly giving way to anger, a dangerous emotion when facing a man who could end his life with a word. You kidnapped an innocent person because your people were too incompetent to verify basic family relationships? The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Alexandro's storm gray eyes hardened into chips of Arctic ice, and suddenly Kai was acutely aware of exactly who he was talking to. This wasn't just some privileged rich boy playing at being dangerous. This was the heir to an empire built on blood and fear. A man who probably killed his first enemy before Kai had even kissed his first girlfriend. "I would be very careful about your next words," Alexandro said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded violence. But instead of cowering, Kai found himself leaning forward, meeting those dangerous eyes with defiance that surprised them both. "Then what's your purpose in keeping me here? Because it seems like you're in quite the predicament, Alessandro Torino. You've got the wrong hostage, no leverage, and now a very expensive problem on your hands." Chapter 2. 3 weeks dissolved into a routine that felt surreal in its luxury. Kai woke up each morning in sheets that probably cost more than his rent, ate meals prepared by a chef who undoubtedly trained in Michelin-starred kitchens, and spent his days in a library that would make Harvard weep with envy. He was a prisoner in paradise, and the irony wasn't lost on him. The mansion itself was a study of contradictions. Beauty and menace intertwined like lovers in a deadly dance. Every marble statue was positioned to conceal security cameras. Every oil painting hit reinforced steel, and every servant moved with the kind of awareness that suggested extensive training in more than just household management. Kai mapped it all out, memorized guard rotations, identified weak points, and planned escape routes he knew he'd never use. Because the most dangerous trap wasn't the locked doors or armed guards, it was Alessandro himself. The young Don visited daily, sometimes to extract information about his father's whereabouts, which Kai generally didn't possess, other times simply to observe. Their conversations became intricate verbal sparring matches, each probing for weaknesses while carefully guarding their own. "Dostoevsky," Alessandro noted one afternoon, settling into what had become his customary chair, while Kai pretended to read. "Crime and Punishment" seemed appropriate, though I have to say Raskolnikov's guilt complex is rather foreign to me. "Is it? A young man who believes himself above conventional morality, who thinks his intelligence justifies his actions. I see certain parallels." I finally lifted my eyes from the book, meeting Alessandro's gaze directly. "The difference is that I'm not the one who chose to commit the crime. I'm just the one paying for it. We're all paying for someone else's crimes, in one way or another." There was something in Alessandro's tone, a note of pain, quickly suppressed, that made Kai study him more carefully. In the golden afternoon light streaming through the library windows, Alessandro looked younger than his years. The perfectly styled dark hair couldn't quite hide the shadows under his eyes, and the expensive clothing couldn't disguise the tension that seemed to live in his shoulders. "How old are you?" Kai asked suddenly. 25. "Young to be running an empire." Alessandro's laugh was hollow. "Age is irrelevant when your alternatives are death or watching everything your family built crumble into dust." "That sounds like experience talking." "It is. My father was murdered when I was 22. Shot down in his own driveway by rivals who thought his son was too soft, too educated, too a mannequin to hold power." The admission hung between them like a confession, and Kai felt something shift in his chest. Not sympathy, exactly, but recognition. Were they right? Alessandro's laugh was hollow. 6 months afterwards, those same rivals were feeding fish at the bottom of the East River. Their families now work for me. What do you think? Chapter 3. The first real crack in Alessandro's armor appeared during a thunderstorm that turned the night sky into a war zone. Kai woke to the sound of raised voices echoing through the mansion's marble halls, Alessandro arguing with someone in rapid, furious Italian. The words were too fast for Kai's limited grasp of the language, but the tone was unmistakable. Desperation barely held in check by iron control. When morning came, Alessandro appeared in the library doorway looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, shirt wrinkled, tie askew, hair falling across his forehead in dark waves. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless hours and decisions that would haunt him. Rough night? Kai asked, closing the journal where he'd been sketching escape plans he'd never used. Alessandro's laugh was bitter. Every night is rough when you're 25, responsible for 300 families, and fighting a war on 6 different fronts while trying to keep your own people from staging a coup. It was the most honest thing Alessandro had ever shared, and it hung between them like a bridge across dangerous territory. Kai found himself leaning forward, studying this glimpse of the man behind the marble facade. Is that what you wanted? To inherit all of this? What I wanted stopped mattering the night I held my father while he bled out on our front steps. Alessandro's voice was steady, but Kai caught the tremor underneath. Old pain that had never properly healed. I was 22 years old, 2 months out of Colombia with an MBA I thought would help me modernize the family business. Instead, I had to choose between taking control or watching everything we'd built for a century crumble while our enemies carved up our territory. That's a hell of a choice for someone barely out of college. You're barely out of college, Alessandro pointed out, and there was something almost vulnerable in the way he met Kai's eyes. If someone put that kind of weight on your shoulders tomorrow, what would you do? Kai considered the question seriously, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle piece. I don't know, he admitted finally. I hope I never have to find out, but I suppose I try to find a way to carry it without losing myself completely. Something in his honest response seemed to surprise Alessandro. For a moment, the carefully constructed mask slipped entirely, and Kai saw not a ruthless crime lord, but a young man drowning under the weight of legacy and expectation, fighting desperately to keep his head above water while sharks circled below. Most people would say they walk away, Alessandro said quietly. Most people have that option. Their eyes met and held, and Kai felt something dangerous spark between them. Recognition, understanding. The acknowledgement of 2 people who understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Chapter 4. The shift in their dynamic was subtle but seismic. Conversations grew longer, more personal, tinged with an electric tension that neither could ignore. Alessandro began bringing books from his extensive private collection. Not just any books, but first editions that made Kai's heart race with more than just their literary significance. Neruda, Kai briefed one evening, running reverent fingers over the leather binding of 20 love poems in a song of desperation. The book was pristine despite its age, protected by custom climate control and the kind of care usually reserved for holy relics. You read Spanish? Alessandro asked, settling into his chair with predatory grace. He'd abandoned his jacket somewhere, his white shirt rolled up to reveal forearms that speak on hidden strength beneath the civilized exterior. Literature major, remember? I read everything I can get my hands on. Kai looked up to find Alessandro watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. This must be worth a fortune. Some things are worth more than money. The words hung heavy with implication, charged with meanings that neither dared voice. Kai felt his pulse quicken as Alessandro rose from his chair, moving closer with the fluid grace of a predator who had spotted something worth hunting. This is dangerous, Kai whispered, not sure if he meant the proximity, the way Alessandro's cologne was making his head spin, or the fact that his heart was racing like he'd run a marathon. I know, Alessandro's voice was rough velvet, intimate as a caress. He was close enough now that Kai could see flecks of silver in his storm gray eyes, could count the individual eyelashes that framed them. This is dangerous, Kai said, but his voice lacked conviction. Yes, Alessandro agreed, his gaze dropping to Kai's lips. I should, but you won't. No, I won't. The admission hung between them like a loaded gun, and Kai realized with crystalline clarity that they had crossed some invisible line. This was no longer just about his father's death or Alessandro's family obligations. This had become something else entirely, something personal and dangerous and completely unprecedented. Chapter 5. The kiss happened during their most explosive argument yet, a heated exchange about Kai's increasingly bold attempts to test the boundaries of his captivity. Alessandro had found him in the mansion's gardens well after curfew, standing among the white roses that bloomed like ghosts in the moonlight. Fury and something darker burned in Alessandro's eyes as he stalked across the manicured lawn. Do you have any conception of what would happen if my men believed I couldn't control one university student? Alessandro demanded, his cultured voice roughened by anger and something that sounded suspiciously like fear. Then don't let them think that, Kai shot back, spinning to face him instead of retreating. The moonlight turned Alessandro's face into sharp planes of light and shadow, making him look like a fallen angel contemplating violence. Or better yet, let me go. I can't. The words seemed torn from Alessandro's throat. Can't or won't? Both. The admission seemed to surprise them both. Alessandro ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, destroying its careful arrangement. Christ, Kai, do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I enjoy keeping you here like some caged bird? I don't know what you enjoy, Kai said, stepping closer instead of backing away. I'm a complete mystery to you, Alessandro Torino. One minute you're the perfect gentleman, bringing me books and engaging in philosophical discussions. The next, you're reminding me that you could have me killed with a word. Because that's what I am, Alessandro exploded, his carefully maintained control finally shattering. I'm both of those things and more. I'm a killer and a scholar, a monster and a man who reads poetry in 3 languages. I'm someone who can discuss Dante over dinner and then order an execution before dessert arrives. They stood there in the moonlight, breathing hard, the air between them electric with tension that had been building for weeks. The scent of roses surrounded them like a benediction, and somewhere in the distance, night birds called to each other with haunting beauty. I know, Kai said quietly, and the simple acceptance in his voice seemed to break something inside Alessandro's chest. I've known for weeks now, and it should terrify me, but it doesn't. It should make me hate you, but I can't. Alessandro moves first, or maybe Kai did. Later, neither could say for certain. But suddenly, Alessandro's hands were buried in Kai's hair, and Kai was gripping the lapels of his shirt. And they were kissing with the desperate hunger of 2 people who had been dying of thirst and finally found water. Kai tasted like rebellion and poetry, like everything Alessandro had never known he wanted. Alessandro tasted like expensive wine and dangerous promises, like the kind of temptation that ruined empires and toppled kingdoms. When they broke apart, both were breathing like they'd run for their lives. This changes everything, Alessandro said, his forehead resting against Kai's. I know, Kai replied, his fingers still twisted in Alessandro's shirt. I know.
Chapter 6. The mansion's dynamics shifted overnight, subtle but unmistakable. Kai was no longer strictly a prisoner, but he wasn't free either. He existed in some undefined gray area that made everyone nervous. Alessandro's enemies noticed first, of course. They always did. The first attempt on Kai's life came disguised as an act of service. A new servant, unremarkable and forgettable, brought wine to the library where Kai spent his afternoons. Something in the man's eyes, too alert, too focused, made Kai's instincts scream warnings he'd learned to trust over the past months. When the man poured the wine with hands that shook almost imperceptibly, Kai knew. His reflexes, honed by weeks of constant vigilance, saved his life. He knocked the glass away, sending crystal and poisoned wine cascading across priceless Persian rugs. The servant's mask slipped for just an instant, long enough for Kai to see the cold calculation of a professional killer. Alessandro appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel, having heard the commotion. His assessment of the situation took perhaps 3 seconds, and his response was swift and brutal. The would-be assassin was disarmed, subdued, and removed with the kind of efficiency that spoke of extensive practice. Are you hurt? Alessandro demanded, his hands moving over Kai's body with clinical precision, checking for injuries with desperate thoroughness of someone who had nearly lost something precious. I'm fine, Kai assured him, though his hands were shaking with delayed reaction. Just a smart cut from the glass. Alessandro's expression as he examined the shallow cut on Kai's forearm was murderous. "They think you're making me weak," he said quietly, as his personal physician treated the minor wound. "Are they right?" Kai asked Alessandro's face in the lamplight. Alessandro's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. They're about to find out exactly how wrong they are. What followed was swift, brutal, and comprehensive. A reminder to all of Alessandro's enemies that apparent kindness should never be mistaken for actual weakness. Within 48 hours, 3 rival families found their operations in ruins, their leaders disappeared, and their remaining members suddenly very eager to negotiate peaceful coexistence. But privately, in the quiet hours when Alessandro sat by Kai's bed and watched him sleep, he knew his enemies weren't entirely wrong. Kai had changed him, made him want things beyond power and control, made him dream of possibilities he thought were forever beyond his reach. "I should let you go," Alessandro said one evening as they shared wine and conversation in his private study, the flames from the massive fireplace casting dancing shadows across walls lined with leather-bound books and original masterpieces. "But you won't," Kai observed, settling deeper into the leather sofa they now shared without pretense. "I can't, not anymore." Alessandro set down his wine glass and turned to face him fully, and Kai saw raw vulnerability in those storm gray eyes. "Not because of your father's death or family obligations or any of the rational reasons I tell myself, but because somewhere in the last few months, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with you, and that makes you both my greatest strength and my most dangerous weakness." Chapter 7. Kai's response was not words, but action. He set aside his own wine and closed the distance between them. And this time their kiss was different, not born of anger or desperate hunger, but of choice and acceptance and the terrible, beautiful certainty of 2 souls recognizing their perfect, dangerous match. "Then we changed the game," Kai murmured against Alessandro's lips, his hands mapping the contours of a face he'd memorized in stolen glances. "How?" Alessandro breathed, his control hanging by threads as Kai's fingers worked at the buttons of his shirt. Kai pulled back to meet his eyes, and Alessandro saw steel there he had always suspected but never fully witnessed. The kind of strength that bent but never broke, that adapted and overcame and emerged victorious against impossible odds. "By making me your partner in everything." That night, Alessandro led him not to the guest room where Kai had spent months in luxurious captivity, but to his own private chambers. The master suite was a study in power and taste, dominated by a massive bed that could have accommodated a small armbeam, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the estate's grounds like a king surveying his domain, and furnishings that whispered of wealth accumulated over generations of careful violence. Moonlight spilled across dark silk sheets as Alessandro paused at the threshold, his usual commanding presence tempered by something Kai had never seen before. Uncertainty, vulnerability, the fear of a man who had never allowed himself to want something this much. "Are you certain?" Alessandro asked, his voice rough with desire and deeper emotions he struggled to voice. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back for either of us." Kai's answer was to pull Alessandro down for another kiss, deeper this time, full of promise and demand. "I've been certain since the moment I realized I was falling in love with my captor, which should probably concern me more than it does." Alessandro's laugh was rough with desire as he backed Kai towards the bed, their bodies moving together with the desperate grace of lovers who had found their perfect, dangerous match. "Everything about this should concern us both." But concern was the last thing on either of their minds as they fell onto silk sheets worth more than most people's cars. When Alessandro's shirt hit the floor, Kai's breath caught at the network of scars scattered across his chest and shoulders. A roadmap of violence survived and lessons learned in blood. Each one has a story, Alessandro said quietly, watching Kai's reaction with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to trust easily. Tell me, Kai whispered, tracing a particularly jagged scar along his ribs with fingers that trembled with more than desire. Later, Alessandro promised as he captured Kai's mouth again with desperate hunger. Right now, I want to focus on making new memories, better memories. The night unfolded in whispered confessions and reverent touches, the careful walls they'd built around themselves crumbling like ancient fortifications under siege. Alessandro was gentle at first, almost worshipful, as if afraid Kai would disappear if handled too roughly. But Kai was not having any of it. This was not a man who wanted to be treated like fragile glass, and he made that abundantly clear. "I won't break," he gasped, arching into Alessandro's touch with shameless need. "I'm not some delicate flower who needs protecting from your darkness, Alessandro. I've seen what you are, what you're capable of, and I'm still here. Promise me," he desperately demanded, his hands mapping every inch of Kai's skin like he was memorizing a prayer. Promise. Promise me you won't disappear. Promise me this isn't some elaborate plan to escape." "I promise," he replied, sealing the vow with the kiss that tasted of wine and danger and forever. "I'm exactly where I want to be." They moved together in the moonlight with the synchronized grace of lovers who had found their perfect, dangerous match, claiming each other with a passion that was both tender and consuming. When Kai cried out Alessandro's name like a prayer to dark gods, and Alessandro whispered possessive endearment in Italian against Kai's sweat-slicked skin, they both knew there would be no going back from this moment. Afterwards, as they lay entwined in silk sheets that smelled of sex and expensive cologne, Alessandro traced lazy patterns on Kai's bare chest, while Kai played with the chain around his neck, a saint's medallion that seemed almost absurdly incongruous with everything else about him.
My mother gave it to me, Alessandro explained without being asked, his voice soft with old grief. Saint Michael, the warrior archangel. She said even sinners need saints to watch over them, and warriors need protection from their own darkness. And do you feel protected? Alessandro considered this, his fingers stilling their movement. "I do now," he said finally, pressing a kiss to Kai's temple. "For the first time in years, I feel like I have something worth protecting, instead of just something to lose." The proposal that formed in the aftermath of their passion was audacious, dangerous, and completely unprecedented. Crime families didn't have outside partners, especially not former hostages who had been kidnapped by mistake. But as Alessandro looked at Kai, hair mussed from his fingers, lips swollen from kisses, wearing nothing but Alessandro's discarded shirt and a satisfied smile, he realized it might be the most strategically sound decision he'd ever considered. The family would never accept it, Alessandro said, voicing the practical concerns, even as his heart raced at the possibilities. "Then we make them," Kai replied with a smile sharp as any blade Alessandro had ever wielded. "You said I was observant, that I mapped every exit and timed every guard rotation, but that's not all I've been doing, Alessandro. I've been watching, learning, analyzing. I know where the weak points are in your organization, who can be trusted, and who's looking for an opportunity to stab you in the back. I know which families are genuinely loyal, and which ones are just waiting for you to show enough weakness to justify a coup." Alessandro stared at him, seeing not the frightened university student from 4 months ago, but a potential equal, someone who could stand beside him in the darkness he inhabited, someone who could match his intelligence and perhaps even exceed his ruthlessness when necessary. "You're talking about becoming part of this world, really part of it. There's no innocence left after that choice, no going back to university lectures and normal life." "I know." Kai's eyes never wavered, steady as granite and twice as unbreakable. "I'm not going back to my old life anyway, am I? That person who could sit in lecture halls and pretend the world was fundamentally safe and orderly, he died the day I woke up in this room. The question is, what do we build from what's left?" 1 year later, the Torino family had consolidated more power than they'd held in 3 generations. The young Don's mysterious partner, officially introduced as his chief strategist and unofficially recognized as something far more significant, had proven invaluable in negotiations, long-term planning, and the subtle art of knowing when to use a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. Kai stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alessandro's office, their office now, watching the city spread out below them like a living map of territory won, and held through careful strategy and, when necessary, precisely applied violence. The lights twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing lives touched by their influence, businesses that operated under their protection, enemies who had learned to fear the name Torino with renewed respect. "Any regrets?" asked Alessandro, joining him at the window. He was impeccably dressed as always, but now there was something different about him, a contentment that hadn't existed before, a sense of completeness that came from finding his perfect complement. Kai considered the question with the same seriousness he brought to everything now. His hands weren't entirely clean anymore, couldn't be, in the life they'd chosen together. He had made decisions that would have horrified his younger self, had approved operations that crossed lines he'd once thought were uncrossable. But he also had prevented unnecessary bloodshed, had found elegant solutions to problems that would have once been solved with brute force, and had helped build something unprecedented in the criminal underworld, a partnership based on intellectual equality rather than simple domination. "Just one," he said finally, turning to face the man that had become his world, his partner, his perfectly dangerous match. Alessandro tensed slightly, old insecurities never entirely banished. "What's that?" Kai's smile was sharp and confident, and completely at home in the shadows they now ruled together. It was a smile of a man who had found his calling in the most unlikely place, who had discovered that sometimes love came wearing the face of danger, that your men took so long to kidnap the right person. Alessandro's answering laugh was rich and genuine, and when he pulled Kai close, it was with the certainty that they had built something unprecedented together, an empire forged not just in fear and power, but in the recognition of two souls who had found their perfect, beautiful, terrible match. Outside the windows, the city sparkled in the darkness like a jewel in black velvet, and at its heart, two young kings planned their next move in the endless, exquisite, dangerous game they had chosen to play together. Not as captor and captive, not as criminal and victim, but as equals in the shadows, partners in power, and lovers who had found that sometimes the most beautiful things grew in the darkest soil. The empire they ruled was built on blood and fear, on careful violence and strategic mercy, but at its foundation lay something unprecedented in their world. Love that had bloomed in impossible circumstances, trust earned through shared danger, and the unshakable certainty that they were stronger together than they ever could be apart. Appreciate you watching. Hit subscribe, like, and share. See you in the next story.